been a very, very busy news cycle these past few months. And even if you've been slightly paying attention, you know good and well that majority of said news consist of matters relating to war. This country and this country at war. This country just bombed this country. This country and this country are now beefing and look like they might be going to war soon. And our country somehow seems to be caught in the middle of all of it. Now, my generation, Gen Z, I'm Gen Z, but I'm right on the cusp of like the millennials, but technically I'm classified as Gen Z. What we like to do when faced with, for example, the terrifying constant coverage of the wars happening around the world is we like to make memes, okay? We like to find humor that we can extract from the chaos and find a way to just laugh about it to ease the anxiety. Okay, as morbid as it sounds, it does not come from a place of disrespect. It does not come from a place of lack of empathy. Like I said, it's just sort of a coping mechanism, okay? But in that coping, in the memes, okay, we sometimes tend to lose exactly just how serious the situation at hand really is. Because every time another bomb is dropped, yes, you get headlines about it, but immediately after, you get more memes. So it's easy to lose sight of just how serious this shit really is. It's easy to kind of see it as all just a joke at a certain point. But every now and again, you get a stark reminder of just how devastating and horrific this shit actually is. And a few weeks ago, while scrolling on TikTok, something that I do far too often, not ashamed to admit, I came across a video, a piece of footage, found footage, that was taken from an action camera, a GoPro action camera that was mounted onto the helmet of a United States Green Beret. Now, the GoPro, the footage from that GoPro was depicting that Green Beret, the Green Berets who were accompanying him, and of course the friendly Niger forces who were accompanying all of them, all being ambushed and overrun. Nothing was censored. Everything was there to see. Now, I say all this, and you might think to yourself, if this guy is recording himself and all of his colleagues being ambushed, how does something like that end up on the internet? Because even if he survived, surely a lot of his colleagues or some of his colleagues didn't. So why would he think to put that on the internet? Well, he did not put it on the internet himself. That same GoPro that captured everything was taken from that soldier's helmet by radical Islamist militants. And that footage was leaked onto the internet. Now, this happened in 2017 in a small village in Africa. But the footage again resurfaced this year and kind of started making its rounds on the internet. And that was the stark reminder I needed. It kind of snapped me back into reality that, man, this shit is truly horrific, because that piece of footage was some of the most horrific that I'd ever seen. I mean, it was terrible. And that piece of footage depicted the Tongo Tongo Ambush. So let's get into it. Now, in order to really get an understanding, get a grasp of the events that led up to that horrific ambush in the desert of North Africa, we kind of got to go back to the beginning of the whole debacle in the first place, okay? Because this all falls under the war that was the global war on terror that was kicked off in the early 2000s following the September 11th attacks, okay? Now, you ask yourself, if the global war on terror took place in primarily the Middle East, then how the fuck did our men end up being ambushed in the desert of sub-Saharan Africa? Well, those same radical Islamist groups that we were so dedicated to fighting were beginning to spread, and that was really their whole mission. Their whole mission was to spread their influence and their control over their neighboring regions and eventually the world, right? And so with Africa being so close and a lot of those countries in Africa being so impoverished, they saw Africa as a hotbed of opportunity to recruit young men into their rebel fighting forces. And one country that was at the main stage of this whole invasion of influence was a country by the name of Niger. Now, Niger is a sub-Saharan country, so that means it sits pretty much in the heart of the sub-Saharan desert. It's rather large in terms of landmass, but as far as population goes, it's not massive, okay? And that is because there are a lot of push factors. One of those push factors being a very, very limited supply of resources, okay? Now, the locals, the citizens of Niger they categorize themselves by tribes. Ethnic tribes. And two really prominent tribes that are going to play a major part in this story later on are the Fulani and the Tuareg tribe, okay? Now, as mentioned before, this country, Niger, became a hotbed for Islamic radical terror groups, okay? They were popping up like crazy. And so the country of Niger, of course, with their pretty limited resources, partnered up with France. And France had deployed in that country, and they kind of partnered up and began taking out Islamist groups that were operating in sub-Saharan Africa from the inside out. And they were doing a pretty damn good job at it, okay? But the United States, being the leader in the global war on terror, and a situation happening years prior that led to kind of a diplomatic falling out between the United States and France, they saw this as an opportunity to kind of get back in the good graces of France and sort of build a strong alliance with them once again. And so the United States, they began to have diplomatic conversations with the country of Niger and France, and they pretty much come to an agreement that, hey, we want to help you guys fight these radical Islamic groups that are taking over your country. And we want to do that not by deploying soldiers and putting boots on the ground, but we want to put drones in the sky. And in order to do that, we got to build bases in that country to operate these drones out of. And that's exactly what the United States does. And that's pretty much how we end up in Niger. Now, at first, we send 150 primarily special forces units to the country to sort of oversee and guide in the operation of the construction of these drone bases, okay? But in the year 2015, October 2015 to be exact, we signed an official treaty with the country of Niger, and it pretty much states like, yo, this is Niger talking, like, yo, you guys have been doing great in our country. You've really assisted us a lot. So we're pretty much going to set up an open door policy. And you guys can bring in as many soldiers and resources as you need to continue to assist us in this mighty war on global terror, okay? And by the year 2017, October 1st, 2017, if you want to really pinpoint it down, we had over 800 U.S. personnel operating in the country of Niger, okay? Which is quite a bit of soldiers, okay? So we obviously saw that there was a lot of value in this country for, being used as a strategic point in this global war. They were now building a second base in the city of Agadez, Niger, which is actually the 5th largest city in the country, okay? And things are looking good. Things are looking great. But as the United States is doing their surveillance with these drones that we set up in that country, they begin to note that one prominent group just keeps popping up. And their influence seems to have the strongest grip on the people of Niger and even surrounding countries like the country of Mali, which sat directly to the east of Niger. So much so that the United States and France and the Niger armed forces decide like, yo, these guys are our primary suspects. We're really going to keep an eye on them. And they do just that. And that group would go by the name Islamic State in Greater Sahara. The Islamic State in Greater Sahara, or ISGS, if you want to shorten it, okay? Now, the ISGS was a radical Al-Qaeda faction, actually. They're a faction associated with Al-Qaeda that kind of had a falling out, and they were sort of swept up under the ISIS umbrella, which at the time was gaining a lot of prominence, and they kind of became the main characters in this whole global fight on terror, right? And so the ISGS, which is, as the name suggests, operating in the Greater Sahara Desert, so primarily Africa and African countries, were really, really doing some damage. And in fact, in the year 2016 up until present day, at the time of making this video, they're responsible for over 46 terror attacks in that region alone. So they obviously had been very, very busy. And they were at the top of our priority list. And even more so at the top of our priority list was a gentleman by the name of Dundu Shefu. Now, Dundu Shefu, remember those tribes I was talking about earlier? Dundu Shefu fell under the Fulani tribe, the ethnic Fulani tribe. Now, the country of Niger, their main export was uranium. Now, uranium alone was not enough to fuel the entire economy for this country to thrive. So the locals would turn to cattle herding as their main source of bread and butter. Okay. Now you got the Fulani tribe, which Dundu Shefu fell under, and you have the Tuareg tribe, which lived close to the Fulani tribe in close proximity. And they were a nomadic tribe, the Tuareg tribe, and they pretty much follow the resources, and they were like opportunistic people. Okay. And so with the Fulani being herders and skilled herdsmen, and the Tuareg being nomads who'd follow the resources, if cattle is a resource in this country, what do you think the Tuareg people were doing? They were fucking stealing a lot of cattle from the Fulani people, okay? But another major source of income for the Tuareg men was they would migrate to the country, also in Africa, the country of Libya. Now, at the time, Libya was under the control of Gaddafi. Now, Muammar Gaddafi was a pretty radical dictator himself, okay? And his movement stirred up a lot of trouble in the region, so much so that he would have to employ militants from local countries to help him maintain power in his country. And some of the locals, a lot of the locals that he would recruit were the Tuareg men. Well, in 2011, when Gaddafi's regime fell and he was killed, this displaced a lot of Tuareg men and forced them back to their country of Niger, again, putting them back in a state of survival as they would hunt and do what they can to search for resources. But this time, these men are war tested. They're hardened, and they begin stealing cattle from the Fulani people in a much more violent manner. So much so that the Fulani people felt that it was best that they learn to take arms and become skilled in combat solely for the purpose of protecting their cattle. Now, after a skirmish that took place between the two tribes in the early 2000s, left 46 Fulani people dead and their cattle slaughtered, the Fulani people decided that, look, we've got to really step it up a notch. We've got to get better supplies, better equipment, and we've got to get better tactics. We've got to become more skilled in the art of combat to make sure that our people are safe from this evil Tuareg tribe. And they do that. But who do they turn to acquire this skill in weaponry? Well, none other than the Islamic State in Greater Sahara. And so now you have a whole tribe of Fulani men who were taking up arms and swearing allegiance to radical Islamic groups in exchange for weaponry and the protection of their cattle. And then you have Dundu Shefu, who was just another cattle herder belonging to the Fulani tribe, now being swept up and swearing allegiance to the Islamic State in Greater Sahara. Dundu Shefu already had a reputation of being pretty violent when it came to protecting his cattle, even before Islamic State in Greater Sahara was operating in his area. He was just really about protecting his cattle. And so with that reputation preceding him, when the Islamic State in Greater Sahara did enter the region, they went and pursued Dundu Shefu. And that same guy was linked back to the kidnapping of a United Nations aid worker who was helping out with a famine that was taking place in the country at the time. So this guy, Dundu Shefu, went from being just somebody that was on the radar, someone to keep an eye on, to now somebody that was fucking dangerous. And I also felt to mention that this motherfucker was not just a regular Islamic militant. He was a commander in the faction of the Islamic State in Greater Sahara. So he had some rank as well. So we decide that, yeah, this guy's got to go. He either needs to be captured or killed. And we need to send the best of the best to do so. And maybe one of those guys will happen to be wearing a GoPro and film the whole thing. And so we do just that. We design a mission. On October 2nd, 2017, U.S. Special Forces team from the 3rd Special Forces Group based in Wallam received intel that ISGS commander Dundu Shefu was potentially located near the small town of Toloa. Following this intel, the team submitted a mission plan to collect reconnaissance in the vicinity of Toloa the following day. The plan is approved. And on October 3rd, 2017, at 5:59 a.m. local time, a team of 8 Special Forces operators, 2 support troops, and an intel contractor set off on a mission with the assistance of 35 Nigerian personnel from the Security and Intelligence Battalion and the Special Forces Interdiction Unit, which is a fancy word for saying the Niger Armed Forces. So you got the best of the best from Niger and the best of the best from the United States coming together to go hunt this motherfucker down who we think is in Toloa, right? And if not, that's fine. We're just there to collect intel anyway, right? Right. So they set off, and they set off in an 8-vehicle convoy, with 3 of those vehicles containing the American team and 5 of those vehicles, the remaining 5, containing the Niger Armed Forces, okay? Now, one of the vehicles that the friendly Niger force was driving in was outfitted with CIA-level reconnaissance equipment because, again, this was just a mission to collect intel in the town of Toloa. And so they make their way to the town some hours later, okay? It's a few hours north, actually, of the base in Wallam that they're situated in, okay? And when they get there, they immediately realize that it's a ghost town. Dundu Shefu and his men are not there. There's really no intel to collect. And realizing that it's pretty much the whole thing was a dud, they begin to make their way back. But on their way back, they receive more intel from headquarters that Dundu Shefu was actually spotted. Him and his men were spotted in a town just off the coast of the Mali border. And so just off the coast of the border of the country of Mali, they believe that there's a settlement that he and his men, Dundu Shefu and his men, had set up. And so this is pretty time-sensitive information that they're receiving on their way back to base. And they realize that if they don't act now, then they're not gonna, perhaps this guy's gonna get away again. But they also realize that, fuck, we're only equipped for a simple reconnaissance mission. And if we were to go and set off on this impromptu kill or capture mission, we don't have the resources to do it. And Captain Perezzini is like, my men are going to get hurt. Now, Captain Perezzini was the commander of the whole operation. He was the captain of the entire force that was out there that day on that mission. And he's like, if I just all of a sudden send my guys out to go and take on an entire militia and a bloodthirsty commander in Dundu Shefu, then almost more than certainly my guys are going to get hurt or even worse, killed. And that can't happen. And so Captain Perezzini contacts headquarters and he's like, dude, I'm not doing this. I don't think this is a good idea. I don't want to send my men into a war zone like this when we're only equipped for a simple reconnaissance mission. I mean, the vehicles that we're driving in this convoy, they're not even bulletproof. We're essentially sitting ducks out here. But his concern and his pushback is overruled. And it's overruled by higher-ups at the Department of Defense. And they're essentially made to conduct a kill or capture mission when they're only equipped for a simple reconnaissance mission where the plan was not even to come into any enemy contact. Now they got to go kill one of the toughest and hardened commanders of the Islamic State in Greater Sahara? Well, good luck. But the plan was kind of rewritten, and they were not expected to go on alone anymore. because 2 French helicopters were now tasked with assisting and being the main source of attack once they reached the settlement that Dundushefu and his men were situated at. And Captain Perezzini and his men were now tasked with sort of acting as backup for the helicopters to essentially do the main job here, right? But due to inclement weather, the helicopters are grounded and they can no longer assist Captain Perezzini and the force in the capture or kill mission of Dundushefu. And so once again, Captain Perezzini and his men are all alone, forced to do this insane task on their own. Now the team would slowly make their way towards the Mali border, towards where they believe this settlement is. And after a few hours of driving through the desert in the nighttime, they finally reach the settlement. And again, they realize that Dundushefu is nowhere to be found. But it's not all bad, because there are clear signs that he and his men had been there recently. Because a bunch of their supplies, their rations, and a bunch of dirt bikes, which they most commonly use to traverse the desert, were all left behind. And so what do? Fuck it. They destroy everything. They destroy the settlement, they destroy the rations, and they destroy the motorbikes, leaving Dundushefu and his men slightly crippled and now lacking in resources. So wherever they are, if they were to return back to that settlement, they'd be kind of screwed. And so after destroying all of the vital resources, the American and Nigerian forces, with Captain Perezzini leading the whole operation, began to make their way back, heading south to Wallam Base, where they were stationed. And they're making their way back. They're heading south at 8:30 a.m. local time. The American and Niger forces would make a stop at the small town of Tongo Tongo. And on October 4th, 2017 at 10:30 a.m., the convoy would roll through the village of Tongo Tongo, where they would make a brief stop so that the Niger forces accompanying the American forces can refuel and eat breakfast and get water. Now, during this stop, something very, very strange happens. At the village of Tongo Tongo, village leaders approach the Americans who had just now stepped foot in this village, and they demand that they have a KLE, which in military term is a key leader engagement. Okay. So what a key leader engagement is essentially a meeting that would take place between American forces in the area and village leaders in the area, not just the village of Tongo Tongo, but whatever village the Americans happen to be in. Now, key leader engagements are very important for United States diplomacy, because when we're deploying and sending all of these troops to foreign lands, a lot of the locals are not so fond of these strange military forces moving in on their land. And so the United States would have to conduct key leader engagement with village elders to essentially gain the trust and the peace of the leaders of these villages. And pretty much that would give the okay for the Americans to operate in whatever region they happen to be operating in. In this case, it's the region of the Sahara Desert and the village of Tongo Tongo. And so they began conducting a key leader engagement, a meeting of the mind between the Americans and the leaders of the Tongo Tongo village. Okay. Now the Americans, they realize that they're kind of out here. They're in very hostile territory. They really should have been home a long time ago, but they got sent on a whole other impromptu mission. So now they're really just out here with no backup, and they want to get back to base where it's safe as soon as possible. They're already behind schedule. And so they radio this in to their superiors. And again, they're told to stay in the village and conduct this key leader engagement with the village elders. Pretty much just do as they're told, man. Like, we gotta maintain diplomacy here in this region. So if they want to have a key leader engagement, a meeting with you guys, then fucking have the meeting. And so they do that against their better judgment. The American forces do that. They're so off-put and uneasy about having this meeting that they decide that they would split up the American forces in 2 parties. Now, one party was to actually attend the meeting in the village, and the other party was to guard the vehicles that were situated just outside of the village, okay? And as the team that was tasked with attending the meeting is having the meeting inside of the village, the team that was tasked with guarding the vehicles outside of the village began to grow rather suspicious when they see two motorbikes at a certain point, two dirt bikes fleeing from the village, which is supposed to be conducting a meeting at this time, like a major, this is essentially the equivalent of a town hall meeting. So nobody in the village should be hauling ass outside of the village on dirt bikes, which are vehicles commonly used by the Islamic State in Greater Sahara in that region to traverse the desert. And so the team guarding the vehicles is like, what the fuck? Like, we gotta go. And so they begin to tell their guys like, yo, cut the meeting. Our Niger partner forces, you guys hurry up with your breakfast. Like, we gotta load up and get the hell out of here. And they begin to do that, but they're stopped in their tracks. The team that was at the meeting are stopped in their tracks by the leaders in the Tongo Tongo village, because their leadership begins to stall and ask questions and essentially lead them on and make them stay in the village a lot longer than they had planned on doing, okay? And both Niger and American forces at this point become very suspicious of the Tongo Tongo leadership. It seems like they've got something going on, like they're up to something. Like, we're trying to leave, but these motherfuckers keep asking us stalling questions, trying to stall us and have us stay here longer than we're wanting to. But because they were given orders to attend the meeting and kind of answer all their questions by their superiors, they're forced to do so. And they ended up staying in the village for 30 minutes longer than they had anticipated, okay? And at 11:35 a.m., the meeting is finally adjourned. They can finally begin to go their separate ways, right? They think that the leadership in the Tongo Tongo village are happy, and so they begin to hit the road. And they get back into that 8-vehicle convoy, and they begin to make their way out of the village. Right? And as they're leaving the village, they're finally on their way back to their base in Wallam, where it's safe. The vehicle at the very end of the convoy begins receiving gunfire. Now, this is the part where a pretty bad day becomes a very bad day, because the convoy was now under attack. And they began receiving gunfire from a tree line situated just north of the village. Now, the convoy is about 110 yards away when they start receiving these shots. So they don't make it very far. And so it's pretty evident that whoever was sending these shots had been waiting and propped up and were waiting for the convoy to make their exit. And once they got out of that village, immediately out of the village, they attack. This whole ambush that I'm about to get into right now was very controversial. It was very controversial because, as I said before, like, clearly the American and Niger teams did not want to be there. They wanted to go back to base days prior, but they kept being overruled by leadership. And also, you have a situation where you have a team of United States soldiers being ambushed, and one of the gentlemen in the ambush that is being ambushed is filming everything. And so the public can see exactly what these men were thrown into because of poor leadership, right? And so when this whole thing kind of broke the surface and came into the public eye, the public had questions. This is back in 2017. The public had mad questions. And so as a response, the Department of Defense began holding press conferences and addressing the public, and they hatched up the idea that they're going to create an animation of the whole ambush from start to finish, okay? Now, the Department of Defense released this animation, and last I checked, my tax dollars are funding the whole Department of Defense, so I should be able to use this footage. This footage should be public domain, and so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to use this animation for the rest of this video here, and I'm going to give you a voiceover as to what exactly you're seeing and kind of walk you through what exactly happened during the ambush. Let's get it. So as the bullets began firing, the team quickly dismantled and began firing back on the ISGS force using the concealment of the vehicle. Team Captain Mike Perezzini from United States Vehicle 1 exits his vehicle, which was at the front of the convoy, grabs 4 Niger soldiers, and they begin to make a maneuver on foot to the southeast in an attempt to outflank what they believe at this point is just small enemy forces. United States Vehicle 3 moved further up in the convoy to be closer to United States Vehicle 1. Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, who is wearing the GoPro, moves from United States Vehicle 3 to US Vehicle 2, which was now directly behind him. This is the footage that was leaked to the public in 2017. Niger Vehicle 5 leaves the convoy formation, and when and what direction they left in is still unknown. Commander Mike Perezzini and the 4 Niger soldiers continued their flanking maneuver until they were stopped by a body of water. Despite being stopped, they were still able to eliminate 4 enemy combatants before being outflanked themselves by a much larger than expected enemy force consisting of motorcycles, machine guns, mounted vehicles, and mortars. And at 11:57 a.m., they make their way back to the convoy. At this time, Captain Mike Perezzini made the order to move south in order to prevent the entire convoy from being outflanked and surrounded. The movement was erratic and unorganized due to Niger forces being scattered throughout the woods in an attempt to use the trees for concealment. Now, here's an important part of this ambush and why it was so lopsided and not ideal for the Niger and American forces, okay? If you look at the geography of the region that this ambush took place, there's not much to hide behind. You really only have like bushes and small trees and just flat sand, right? And so whenever you're taking gunfire, whenever somebody is shooting at you, the best thing you want to do is hide behind cover, right? Now in combat, you have cover and you have concealment, okay? Now cover pretty much is something you can hide behind that also offers protection from bullets. It's something that bullets cannot pierce through, right? If you get behind this brick wall, you are covered. Not only are you hiding and not in sight from the gunman, but you're also under the protection of the bulletproof material that you're hiding behind. But concealment is something that only hides you. It offers no protection from the bullets that are flying past you. So while a brick wall would offer cover, a small thorn bush would only offer concealment. It would only be enough to hide you. And so when this ambush takes place, there's nowhere for the American and Niger forces to safely cover themselves. They can only find concealment behind these weak ass thorn bushes and concealment behind their not properly outfitted vehicles that they were in. I mean, the vehicles were not bulletproof, right? So they could essentially, you only could hide behind the vehicles and you only could hide behind the thorn bushes. And the attackers knew where they were. So they're essentially like sitting ducks. And so that's exactly what happens here. So as Mike Perezzini goes to round up the troops, he has to go and round up the Niger forces, Niger soldiers who are concealing themselves behind these bushes that are scattered around the ambush zone. Okay. It's really sad to think about. Like these guys were really in a desperate situation here, man. It's really fucked up. Niger vehicles 3 and 4 were damaged beyond repair and abandoned. Niger vehicles 1 and 2 were the first to depart. And as the team loaded their vehicles, they last spot Staff Sergeants Brian Black, Jeremiah Johnson, and Dustin Wright taking cover behind United States Vehicle 2. Now, the American soldier that was wearing the GoPro was a gentleman by the name of Jeremiah Johnson, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson. And a lot of the footage that we see leaked on the internet is cut. We only get to see 5 minutes. And at this part in the story, this is the beginning of the 5 minutes that we are able to see when Dustin Wright Jeremiah Johnson, and Brian Black are huddled behind vehicle number 2 in their convoy, trying to conceal themselves from the enemy ambush and enemy gunfire. Okay. And they're kind of desperately huddled behind this vehicle. And the team captain, Mike Perezzini, who was still disoriented and thrown off from the whole ambush, looks back at Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson and gives him a signal to start moving. And Jeremiah Johnson, who was now back in the vehicle 2, gives Captain Mike Perezzini a thumbs up, signaling that he is okay to move and follow the convoy. And a smoke grenade was thrown to conceal the team's movement. Now, Staff Sergeant Justin Wright enters and begins driving United States Vehicle 2 with Staff Sergeant Brian Black and Jeremiah Johnson following alongside, using the moving vehicle as concealment. Now, Staff Sergeant Brian Black moves slightly ahead of Vehicle 2 and was killed by enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright exited the vehicle, and together with Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, they moved Brian Black's body to the concealment of Vehicle 2 and remained with his body, firing from their position. However, the fast-moving and heavily armed ISGS combatants quickly overtake their position and force them to retreat, leaving the body of Brian Black still behind Vehicle 2. 92 yards west of United States Vehicle 2, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson was shot and rendered immobile. Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright quickly sees his teammate incapacitated and returns to render aid when he is also gunned down. Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Dustin Wright, and Jeremiah Johnson are killed in action at approximately 12 p.m. local time, with the entire ordeal being filmed on the GoPro action camera mounted on the top of Jeremiah Johnson's helmet. These guys were fucking soldiers, were absolute warriors in every sense of the word, and fought to the last breath. United States Vehicle 1 and 3, as well as 2 Niger vehicles, make it back about a half a mile south of the combat zone referred to as Position 2. So now those vehicles that peeled off from the convoy earlier, they get to a retreat point where they're able to kind of sink in and establish another position of offense where they can hopefully begin to return fire and fend off this ambush that is currently taking place. After realizing not all the vehicles are accounted for at Position 2, 2 United States Special Forces operators volunteer to run back on foot to the ambush zone, aka Position 1. At the same time, the remaining vehicles in Position 2 begin filing out of their vehicles and engaging enemy combatants. Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, a special operations mechanic and driver for the United States Vehicle 3, made his way to the back of Vehicle 3 and began engaging the enemy using a vehicle-mounted machine gun. After using up all of the ammunition in said machine gun, he switches to a sniper rifle and began engaging the enemy from his position using that sniper rifle. Approximately 10 minutes later, 2 more United States team members moved to rejoin the original pair that was running back to the ambush zone. The first 2 made it to where they suspected the other vehicles to be before encountering enemy combatants. They managed to kill several before they were forced to retreat, running into the other 2 United States team members along the way. The group of now 4 United States special operators began planning another route to get back to Vehicle 2. Now, back at Position 2, the American and Niger forces continued fighting enemy combatants to the east, when at 12:25 p.m., enemy forces began opening fire on them from the southeast. Now they are also being flanked. 2 Niger vehicles peel off from the area and began heading to the southwest. Under heavy fire, U.S. Vehicle 1 began circling Position 2, gathering up American and Niger forces as they prepared for their retreat. At the same time, Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson attempts to board United States Vehicle 3. Special Operation members in United States Vehicle 2 last saw LaDavid Johnson and 2 Niger fighters boarding his vehicle, Vehicle 3, as they were retreating, This took place between 12:25 and 12:30 p.m. Both vehicles came under intense enemy fire, causing them to both rapidly retreat. Vehicle 1 mistakenly thought that LaDavid Johnson and the two Niger fighters had safely entered their vehicle and accelerated to the north, unknowingly leaving the three men behind. Unable to leave Vehicle 3, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson and the two Niger fighters with him quickly began moving southwest on foot. The Niger fighters made it roughly a quarter mile before being killed by enemy small arms fire, leaving LaDavid Johnson by himself. Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson is able to evade enemy fire on foot for roughly 1 mile before he conceals himself behind a single thorny tree in the African desert. From his position, he takes his last stand and continues to fight before becoming overrun by enemy combatants. Between 12:30 and 12:45 p.m., Sergeant LaDavid Johnson is killed in action by enemy small arms fire. United States Vehicle 1, now alone and unaware that United States Vehicle 3 is not with them, continue north while taking fire from a pursuing enemy vehicle with a heavy mounted machine gun. All 5 men on board are shot and 1 Niger soldier is killed. The driver of this vehicle is shot through the elbow but continues to drive. Team Captain Mike Perezzini, who is riding in the bed of United States Vehicle 1, was shot and thrown off. The driver of Vehicle 1 performs a circular maneuver and under heavy fire retrieves Captain Perezzini and continues heading north, heading to a nearby tree line. Once inside the tree line, U.S. Vehicle 1 gets stuck in mud and the vehicle is no longer drivable. At the same time, they are spotted and rejoined by the 4 special op members who had left 30 minutes prior to rejoin the convoy at the initial combat zone, Position 1. At 12:33 p.m., the team radios in that they are being overrun. Shortly after sending the emergency message, the team destroy the radio devices to prevent the enemy from being able to use them once they become overrun. At 12:50 p.m., they found a clearing in the north corner of the wooded area where they decide to hunker down and dig in for their final stand. They wrote short letters on personal cell phones to their loved ones, believing that they would surely be killed, and they waited. When at 1:11 p.m., 2 unarmed drones began buzzing over United States and Niger forces and put them in communications with inbound French aircraft. And at 1:18 p.m., 2 French assault Mirage aircraft, these are pretty much like French-made badass like tactical fighter jets that are on their way to pretty much save these guys in what they believe is their final moments. And I mean, this, you couldn't get more cinematic. Like right as they're taking their last stand, they're digging in, they're saying goodbye to their loved ones. They see these drones flying overhead, followed by 2 French badass fighter jets. I mean, the feeling of relief must have been immense, but it's not all good because there's so much chaos happening in this wooded area in the desert that they're unable to determine who is the friendly force and who is the ISGS military combatants. So they're unable to really fire on the position from their jets, right? And so the best that they could do an intimidation tactic called a flyby, where they essentially fly very low to who they suspect to be the enemy combatants as a show of force. Like, hey, motherfuckers, if you guys keep doing this, you see these missiles hanging off the side of this here plane, I'm going to drop them on your ass. And so the team kind of, the ISGS fighters kind of back off. And at 1:30 p.m., the team is able to finally communicate with these drones, and they're able to relay their exact location and the status of casualties, as well as they're able to finally call for a medical evacuation. And at 2:58 p.m., the French fighter jets make yet another flyby, a show of force, and this pretty much is the nail in the coffin. This kind of causes the ISGS fighters to retaliate. They decide that they're Their job is done for the day, and they run for the hills, leaving just the remaining American and Niger forces in that tree line by themselves, waiting for a while for assistance. At 4 p.m., 2 French helicopters, not American, but French helicopters, arrive on scene, and they began searching for the team for upwards of 40 minutes. And finally, a team member decides to reveal himself from a tree line, and he emerges and begins waving and flagging down the French fighters like, "Hey, we're here." And at 4:41 p.m., it is circulated throughout the African Special Forces Command located in Germany that not all of our guys, our soldiers, are accounted for, and there very could likely be a lot of casualties here. And once they receive this news, a mass search party is initiated. And while this happens pretty much simultaneously, Niger friendly forces arrive. A massive convoy arrives, and they're finally able to assist the Niger and American forces. The only issue is the ISGS fighters are long gone, and it's just American and Niger forces scattered around this here tree line. And so as they began like popping up and emerging, thinking their friends are here to save them, the Niger forces began firing on the friendly Niger and American forces, thinking that they're the enemy. And finally, a brave soul and a Niger friendly fighter runs from the tree line, and he begins waving and signaling and saying, "Hey, like, stop firing. We're friendlies here." And luckily, nobody is injured from this friendly attack before it stops. And at exactly 4:55 p.m., the French-flown helicopters were able to establish a landing zone, a safe place to land, and they do just that. They land and began to evacuate the remaining American and Niger fighters who were left over from the ambush. And finally, the nightmare is over. And at 6:25 p.m., Nigerian search and rescue discover the remains of Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, and Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright at the site of the ambush. And Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson's remains have still yet to be found. And throughout the remainder of the evening and 36 hours after the fact, 3 surveillance drones are sent to the area, and they spend pretty much the remainder of that time searching for the body of Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. And still, they come up with nothing. I mean, this guy was able to conceal himself so well that even American friendly forces who have kind of a general idea of where he should be can't find him. I mean, not only did he conceal himself well, but he ran over a mile away from the ambush zone. So they're really having a hard time finding this guy. And additional United States Special Forces teams are sent to the area to aid in the search and rescue and recovery of Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. And on October 6th at 6:25 a.m., as more search and rescue teams are prepping to make their way to the site of the ambush to search for LaDavid Johnson, they receive intel from Tongo Tongo locals that the body of U.S. Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson had been discovered. And at 12 p.m., Niger military arrived at the location that they're given, and they discovered LaDavid Johnson's lifeless body still tucked behind that single thorny tree. Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson was found lying on his back with his arms by his side. He was fully clothed, but a lot of his equipment and his weaponry was missing. And it was revealed that he indeed did fight to the death, and he was never captured in the process. And he went out fighting, and after he went out, his body was raided, and his supplies and ammunition was taken by the enemy ISGS forces. And at 3:22 p.m. local time, LaDavid Johnson's remains are transferred to United States custody. It is estimated that the team of Niger and American fighters had killed 20 to 25 enemy ISGS combatants. In total, the French had responded with 15 aircraft and 53 soldiers in support of the United States forces. Their support was instrumental to the rescue and recovery of our special forces. Now, the Niger military are the first to actually reach on ground the location of the Niger and American fighting forces. Their support in this whole operation was also extremely instrumental. And it kind of goes to show just how much our allies had our back that fucking day, almost to an embarrassing degree. I mean, as much as this story is heartbreaking, what I find to be even more heartbreaking is the poor leadership that had those men out there in the first place, especially when the Captain Mike Perezzini, who was in charge of all those men that day who were out on that mission, didn't want to be there, and he voiced his concerns to his higher-ups, who essentially didn't care. They wanted to be the one to say that they gave the order that sent those men out to capture and kill this prime target in Dandushefu. And in search of those promotions and higher rankings in their position, they cost the life of 8 brave souls. 4 American soldiers were killed. Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright, Staff Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, and Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson. And 4 Nigerian casualties: Gube Mahamadou Isaka, Yakube Isofu, Bagwa Sumana, and Abdul Rashid Yerima. It's not very often that I'm left speechless after telling a story. There's not really much to say that could ease the pain that was felt by the loved ones and the friends of the 8 men who lost their lives that day. But what I can say is, if we can take anything from this story, is the amount of courage that it took for those men to do what they do and literally fighting to the death is something to behold. It's something to be respected. And their legacy will live on through the heroism that they displayed that day. These men were fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. And on that day in particular, warriors. And that's what they will forever be known as. And nothing could change that. Despite them being sent out there on essentially a suicide mission by a leadership that was not quite fit for the job, they chose to carry on with the mission. And as a result, shed light on a serious issue that is the leadership of the men who are sent out to do just that every day. And so because of these guys, we're able to ask these questions. We're able to really analyze who's at the top and should they really be there. And the footage that was captured that day would go on to spark a change that will be felt for generations to come, and a change that will ensure that this type of shit never happens again to any of our fighters. That footage was more impactful than we could ever imagine. And so I just want to say thank you, not only to the 8 men that gave their lives that day, but to the remainder of the men who had to be subjected to such an horrific act and who are still fortunately with us to tell the tale. Your service is greatly appreciated. My name is Iman. This concludes another episode of The Midnight Show. And I want to thank you all so much for tuning in to another episode. I do want to apologize for the hiatus. Your boy's been MIA. Again, just a little burnt out, but it's good to be back, and I'm back with some more heat. And you can expect more uploads on a very, very consistent basis. So I look forward to that. And I thank you all for coming back, and it's so fucking great to be doing this again. It's so nice to be back in front of this camera here, in front of this microphone. And you can expect some more heat next week. But until that point, again, this is The Midnight Show. I bid you all a farewell, and I thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Peace.